The 24th of April, 1951, Korea, 0200 hours. A British staff officer picks up the field telephone at IX Corps headquarters and says 4 words to the man on the other end. Pull them back. They're finished. The man on the other end is an Australian lieutenant colonel named Bruce Ferguson. He's been awake for 31 hours. His battalion, 3 rifle companies, a support company, a handful of mortars, is dug into a valley called Kapyong. In the darkness beyond his perimeter, somewhere in the hills he can't see, approximately 10,000 Chinese soldiers are moving. Ferguson listens to the order. Then he tells the staff officer he won't be pulling anyone back. What happened in the next 14 hours would be studied in military academies for the next 70 years. Not because the Australians won, although they did. Not because the Chinese lost, although they did. Because of what the numbers said when the sun came up. 17 Australians dead, 38 wounded. On the other side of the valley, where a Canadian battalion and a New Zealand artillery regiment had also held the line, the combined UN force had stopped an offensive that threatened to collapse the entire western front of the Korean War. But that's not the part nobody talks about. The part nobody talks about happened before the battle. In the days before Kapyong, a British staff officer looked at a map, looked at the available units, and made a decision. The 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment was not needed at the critical point. They were surplus to requirements. Someone else would cover the valley. The order went out. What happened next, how 3RAR ended up in that valley anyway, and what they did when they got there is what this story is about. What follows is drawn from the 3 RAR war diaries held at the Australian War Memorial, the official histories of the Korean War compiled by Robert O'Neill and published by the AWM, unit records of the Chinese 118th Division, and the oral history collection of veterans who served at Kapyong. Where specific details are reconstructed from the documentary record rather than verbatim accounts, this channel says so. By April 1951, the Korean War had already been going for 9 months, and nobody knew who was winning. The Americans had pushed north, the Chinese had pushed south, MacArthur had been fired, and the front line moved constantly in a way that made the whole thing look less like a war and more like a catastrophic argument that nobody knew how to end. The Chinese Spring Offensive was Beijing's attempt to end it, not by negotiation, by driving UN forces off the Korean peninsula entirely. 300,000 soldiers, moving at night, without the logistical tail that Western armies assumed was necessary for an offensive of that scale. No trucks, no fuel convoys, no supply lines that could be targeted from the air. Each Chinese soldier carried what he needed on his back, ammunition, rice, everything, and moved after dark, when American air power was blind, not as a gradual escalation, as a single coordinated push designed to finish the discussion. If it worked, if the UN forces were driven off the peninsula, South Korea ceased to exist. The United States suffered its first decisive military defeat since the War of 1812, and the balance of power in Asia shifted in ways that would reverberate for decades. The UN commanders knew it was coming. Intelligence had been clear for weeks. What they didn't know was the exact axis of advance, the exact timing, or which units would hit which part of the line first. On the night of April 22nd, they found out the 6th Republic of Korea Division, holding the eastern end of the UN line, collapsed within hours. Not because its soldiers were cowards, they weren't, but because 10,000 Chinese soldiers hit a front that had been designed for 3,000 in darkness simultaneously, and the line simply broke under the weight of it. When a line breaks on one end, the pressure transfers to the units beside it, and the valley at Kapyong, a narrow defile that ran roughly north to south through a range of hills 30 kilometers northeast of the town of Chuncheon, suddenly became the most important piece of terrain in Korea. Because if the Chinese came through Kapyong, they came through to the main supply route. If they came through to the main supply route, IX Corps was cut off. If IX Corps was cut off, the Western Front collapsed, and if the Western Front collapsed, Seoul fell for the second time in 9 months. The staff officer at IX Corps understood the geography. he understood what Kapyong meant. What he did not understand, what the arithmetic he was working with couldn't capture, was what 3 companies of Australians dug into a Korean hillside were actually capable of. The arithmetic said one thing, the soldiers did another. What happened in between is what this story is about. The British staff officer wasn't wrong about the numbers, he was right about the numbers. 10,000 Chinese soldiers against 3 Australian companies on 2 hills, the arithmetic was clear. By every conventional measure of military logic, the order to pull back was the correct order. It was the order any competent staff officer in any army in the world would have given. What he didn't know, what the arithmetic couldn't account for, was that the battalion he was writing off had spent 7 months in Korea doing things that weren't in any manual. He didn't know what Ferguson knew about his men. He didn't know what his men knew about each other. He didn't know that the question of whether a position can be held is never purely a question of numbers. He saw a map. He saw a ratio. He made the call. What happened next is not a story about courage overcoming odds. It's a story about what happens when an institution's model of what soldiers can do collides with what soldiers actually are. And the gap between those two things on the night of April 23rd, on 2 frozen hills in a valley nobody outside Korea had ever heard of, was the difference between a war that continued and a war that ended. The 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment had arrived in Korea in September 1950. By April 1951, they had been in continuous operations for 7 months. They were not fresh troops. They were not well rested. They were lean, experienced, and by the standards of any army in the field, they were exactly the kind of unit you wanted holding critical terrain when everything around them was falling apart. Those 7 months had not been spent in garrison. From the moment they landed, 3 RAR had been thrown into some of the most demanding terrain and weather on the Korean peninsula. They had fought at Pakchon in October 1950, helping to hold a river crossing against Chinese forces that had entered the war days earlier, without any Western intelligence agency predicting it. They had operated through the brutal Korean winter of 1950 to 51, when temperatures dropped to -20 Celsius and equipment froze, and men learned to keep their weapons inside their sleeping bags at night or risk finding them locked solid in the morning. They had learned things in those 7 months that no training exercise can teach. They had learned the specific way Korean terrain funnels movement, how the ridge lines that look like cover from a map become killing grounds when the enemy already occupies the heights. They had learned what happens to units that move too fast through ground they don't understand, and they had learned through the accumulated experience of 7 months of contact what their own men could do when pushed beyond what the manual said was possible. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Ferguson, had spent most of the previous week in the kind of controlled exhaustion that field commanders learn to operate through. He knew his men. He knew what they could do. He had watched them do things in the preceding months that had no entry in any tactical manual improvisations born out of terrain, weather, and the specific brutality of a war that had no clear front line and no clear end. When IX Corps assigned them to Kapyong on the afternoon of April 23rd, Ferguson looked at the valley and made the kind of rapid assessment that experienced commanders make. He placed A Company on a feature called Hill 504 to the north, D Company on Hill 677 to the west, B Company in reserve, the mortar platoon in a position that could support either company depending on where the pressure came from. It was a good defensive layout, it covered the approaches, it gave them flexibility. What it didn't account for, what no defensive layout could account for, was the scale of what was coming. Because the 6th ROK Division wasn't retreating, it was running, and it was running through the Kapyong Valley. At approximately 2,200 hours on April 23rd, the 1st ROK soldiers appeared in the Australian positions. Not as a formed unit, not in tactical order. As individuals, and then as dozens, and then as hundreds men who had been fighting for 24 hours against an enemy they couldn't stop, moving south as fast as they could, through the Australian perimeter, through the darkness, toward the rear. And behind them, following in their wake, came the Chinese. This is the moment that military historians return to again and again when they discuss Kapyong. Because the Australian companies could have done what any reasonable unit might do when its position is being overrun by friendly troops in full retreat, fall back, re-establish contact with headquarters, request new orders. Ferguson didn't fall back. He held. A company on Hill 504 watched the ROK soldiers run past them in the darkness and then turned back to face the direction the ROK soldiers had come from. D Company on Hill 677 did the same. The mortars registered new targets on the approaches to both hills and waited. At approximately 2,300 hours, the first Chinese probing attacks began. What followed through the night of April 23rd into the morning of April 24th is documented in the 3 RAR war diaries held at the Australian War Memorial, in the unit histories of the Chinese 118th Division, and in the testimonies of the men who survived it. It was not a clean battle. It was not the kind of engagement where clear decisions produced clear outcomes. It was 14 hours of fighting in darkness and fog, on steep Korean hillsides, in temperatures that dropped below freezing after midnight, against an enemy whose tactical doctrine relied on mass, momentum, and the psychological impact of sheer numbers. Understanding the Chinese side of Kapyong matters, because without it, the battle looks like a simple story of courage holding against numbers. It was more complicated than that. The Chinese 118th Division was not a conscript formation thrown at an obstacle. It was one of the units that had destroyed the American 2nd Infantry Division at the Chongchon River in November 1950. It had stopped the Marines at the Chosin Reservoir, an engagement that American military historians still regard as one of the most brutal fights in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. The 118th had done things in the preceding 6 months that the Western press described as impossible, and it had done them consistently. Its tactical doctrine was simple and devastating. Move at night, use terrain, don't engage in direct fire exchanges at range, close to fighting distance as fast as possible, where American firepower advantage disappears. Use noise and mass to create psychological impact before physical contact. And above all, keep moving. The doctrine worked because it exploited the specific weakness of Western armies in that terrain and that period. The assumption that darkness and numbers and noise meant the battle was over before it started. The Australians did not share that assumption. The Chinese came in waves. Not metaphorically. Literally, assault after assault, each one pressing the Australian perimeter from a different direction, each one preceded by bugles and whistles and a noise that veterans described as unlike anything they had heard before or since. The sound of 10,000 soldiers moving through darkness toward a fixed position. The sound of an army that expected the men in front of it to break. On Hill 504, a company's weapon pits were dug into the forward slope. The men inside them could hear the Chinese before they could see them, the boots on frozen ground, the equipment rattling despite discipline, the low commands passing along the assault line in a language nobody on the hill understood, then the bugles, then the silence before the first shots. The Korean winter at 2 a.m. is a specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. It's the cold of complete darkness on a hillside you've been digging into for 6 hours, with frozen ground under you and frozen air above you, and the knowledge that whatever is coming through that darkness is bigger than what you have to stop it with. The Australians stayed in their weapon pits, not because they weren't afraid. The AWM oral histories are explicit on this point. Fear was present in quantity in every account. But they had been trained to occupy a position and hold it, and they had been told by Ferguson explicitly and clearly that pulling back was not an option. So they stayed, and they fired. And the Chinese assault broke against the Australian positions and reformed and came again. A company on Hill 504 absorbed 3 separate battalion-scale assaults before dawn. At one point, Chinese soldiers were inside the company perimeter, not at the wire, not at the edge, but inside, among the Australian weapon pits, fighting at ranges measured in meters. Veterans of that night described it in terms that appear repeatedly in the AWM oral history collection. Men standing in weapon pits while Chinese soldiers moved past them in the darkness, close enough to hear breathing. The instinct to fire suppressed not by fear, but by the knowledge that in that darkness, at that range, you could not identify a target without risking your own men. So they waited. some of them for minutes that felt like hours, and when the light came, they were still there. Most of a company was still there. The Chinese weren't, but they came back. On Hill 677 to the west, D Company was fighting a separate battle that the histories of Kapyong sometimes underreport. Hill 677 was the higher feature, more exposed, more difficult to defend, and further from the mortar positions that could provide fire support. D Company's perimeter was longer relative to its strength, which meant that when the Chinese came, they came along more axes simultaneously. The company commander, Major Benno Dowd, had positioned his platoons in a pattern designed to create overlapping fields of fire on the approaches. What he could not anticipate was the scale of the assault or the specific direction it would take. Through the night, D Company fought a battle that was, in some ways, harder than A Company's. The ground worked against them, the Chinese pressure was relentless, and the darkness that protected A Company from accurate fire also prevented D Company from knowing with certainty what was happening 50 meters away. They held, not by a wide margin, not comfortably, but they held, and in holding Hill 677, D Company did something that A Company's defense on 504 depended on. They prevented the Chinese from enfilading the lower hill from the flank. If 677 had fallen, 504 would have become untenable within hours. The two companies held each other's flanks through the night without being able to communicate clearly, without being able to see each other, and without knowing at any given moment whether the other was still there. That's what 7 months in Korea had built. Not just individual soldiers who could hold positions, a battalion that held together when it couldn't see itself. At 0300 hours on April 24th, 9 Corps headquarters received the situation report from Kapyong. 2 Australian companies in contact with forces estimated at regimental strength or greater, ammunition running low, casualty evacuation impossible in darkness, request for resupply and artillery support. This is when the British staff officer picked up the telephone. Pull them back. They're finished. Ferguson's response was not a formal military communication. It was, by the accounts of the signalers present, brief and direct. He was not pulling anyone back. He needed ammunition. He needed artillery. And he needed IX Corps to stop calling him because he was busy. He got the artillery. A New Zealand regiment, 16 Field Regiment, Royal New Zealand Artillery, was firing from positions south of the valley, and through the night they put down fire on the approaches to both hills with a precision and a volume that the Chinese found, by their own subsequent accounts, genuinely shocking. At one point, with Chinese soldiers inside the A Company perimeter and the company commander unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, Ferguson ordered the New Zealand guns to fire directly on his own position, on Hill 504, where his own men were fighting. He called it down on himself. The New Zealanders fired, the Chinese assault collapsed, the Australians, who had been warned and had gone to ground in their weapon pits, survived. The Chinese soldiers who had penetrated the perimeter did not. This is the moment that the official histories record most carefully, because it is the moment that most clearly illustrates what made the defense of Kapyong different from a simple story of courage under fire. Courage was present, obviously, in abundance, in every weapon pit on both hills throughout that night. But what Ferguson did when he called artillery down on his own position wasn't courage. It was a specific and terrible kind of calculation, the willingness to accept risk to his own men in order to preserve the integrity of the position that, if it fell, opened the road to Seoul. He made the calculation. He made it correctly. And Kapyong held. By dawn on April 24th, the situation was this. A company on Hill 504 was still in position, having absorbed 4 battalion-scale assaults through the night. D Company on Hill 677 had repelled 3. The Chinese 118th Division, one of the formations that had stopped the Americans at the Chosin Reservoir 6 months earlier, one of the most decorated units in the People's Liberation Army, had failed to take either hill. The dawn came slowly, the way Korean dawns do in April, gray light seeping through low cloud, the temperature still below freezing, the ground around the Australian positions littered with the debris of a night that would have been unimaginable 12 hours earlier. The men who had been in their weapon pits since before midnight stood up carefully, checked their fields of fire, looked at each other. Some of them had been fighting at arm's reach in the darkness. Some of them had listened to men die within meters of their positions and not been able to do anything about it. Some of them had not fired a shot and felt the particular exhaustion of sustained, motionless terror. What they had in common was that they were still there. The ground in front of the Australian positions told the story of the night in a way that no after-action report could fully capture. The approaches to both hills, the same approaches that the Chinese 118th Division had rehearsed in their tactical doctrine, the same approaches that darkness and noise and mass were supposed to make impassable for defenders, were evidence of an assault that had broken not once but 4 times against 2 companies of Australians who had nowhere to go and had decided not to go there anyway. Ferguson walked the positions in the early morning light. He did not make a speech. He did not need to. He looked at what his men had done, and they looked back at him, and everyone understood what it meant without anyone saying it. The battalion had done what the arithmetic said was impossible. And IX Corps, looking at the map in the morning light, understood something that the British staff officer had not understood the night before. The Australians hadn't been holding a blocking position. They had been holding the hinge of the entire Western Front. If Kapyong had fallen, if Ferguson had followed the order, if he had pulled his companies back and the Chinese had come through the valley, IX Corps would have been cut in half. The supply lines to the American and British units fighting to the west would have been severed. The offensive that Beijing had designed to end the Korean War would have achieved its objective. It didn't achieve its objective, because a lieutenant colonel in a Korean valley told a British staff officer he was busy and went back to fighting. The aftermath of Kapyong produced one of the more complicated episodes in the history of the Korean War's footnotes. The 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment was awarded the United States Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit award the American military can give to a foreign force. It remains one of only 2 Australian units ever to receive it. The citation described the defense of Kapyong as decisive in preventing the encirclement and destruction of IX Corps. The language of the citation is precise and restrained in the way that military citations always are. It describes positions held, assaults repelled, losses sustained. It uses the word decisive. It does not use the word should, as in should not have been there, as in should have been pulled back, as in the battalion that held this position was told to leave before the battle started and refused. The citation acknowledges what happened. It does not examine how close it came to not happening. What the citation also doesn't mention is what happened to the Chinese 118th Division after Kapyong, the division that had destroyed the American 2nd Infantry at Changchun, the division that had stopped the Marines at Chosin, the division that arrived at Kapyong expecting to break through in hours and instead spent 14 hours breaking against 2 Australian companies. The 118th was withdrawn from the line after Kapyong by its own subsequent accounts and by the assessments of Chinese military historians who examined the battle in the decades that followed. The failure at Kapyong was attributed not to the quality of the 118th soldiers who were experienced, disciplined, and brave, but to something the division's commanders had not anticipated. The Australians had not behaved the way the model said they would behave. The model said that darkness and noise and numbers would cause the defenders to break. It had worked at the Chongchon River. It had worked at Chosin, partially. It had worked at the 6th ROK Division 3 days earlier, when the line simply gave way under the weight of what was coming. The Australians didn't break, not because they weren't afraid, because they had been told by their commanding officer that pulling back was not an option, and they believed him, and they stayed in their weapon pits, and they waited for the light. The Chinese Spring Offensive, the 300,000 soldier push designed to end the Korean War, stalled at Kapyong and several points along the line simultaneously. By the end of April 1951, the offensive had been contained. The front stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel. Armistice negotiations began in July. They lasted 2 years. The war ended in July 1953, with the border almost exactly where it had been in June 1950. The British staff officer who had ordered the pullback is not named in the official records. His call was logged, his order was recorded, his name was not. History has a way of doing that. The men of 3RAR came home and went back to farms and factories and offices in Queensland and New South Wales and Victoria. They raised families. They watched television coverage of the Vietnam War and thought about things they didn't say. Some of them talked about Kapyong. Most of them didn't. When they died, most of them in the 1980s and 1990s, some later their obituaries, mentioned their service. Very few mentioned Kapyong specifically. Almost none explained what Kapyong meant. The Korean War is called the Forgotten War, not because it wasn't important. Because it happened between the Second World War and Vietnam, and the world had run out of attention for conflicts that didn't resolve cleanly. It lasted 3 years, cost 3 million lives, and ended with an armistice that is technically still in effect today, not a peace treaty, an armistice, a pause. And the border between North and South Korea is almost exactly where it was when the fighting started, 3 years, 3 million dead, roughly the same line. There is a specific and uncomfortable reason why Kapyong in particular was ignored for so long, beyond the general neglect of the Korean War. The battle made the United Nations command look incompetent, not heroically incompetent, the kind of incompetence that produces a Gallipoli, a story of sacrifice that a nation can process and mourn and memorialize, bureaucratically incompetent, the kind that comes from a staff officer in a warm tent making a decision about soldiers he'd never met based on numbers that didn't account for what those soldiers actually were. The Australians had been written off. Not dramatically, not in the heat of battle, quietly, administratively, by someone doing triage on a map and deciding that 3RAR was not worth the coordination. The order to pull back was not a tactical decision. It was a clerical error at the scale of a war, and it was overruled by a lieutenant colonel with a field telephone who said he was busy. That story is not easy for any headquarters to celebrate. It raises questions that institutions prefer not to answer. Who gave the order? Why? What would have happened if Ferguson had followed it? The Presidential Unit Citation acknowledged the outcome without examining the process that nearly prevented it. The British staff officer's name was not recorded. The conversation was not transcribed. History moved on. The men who fought at Kapyong knew what they had done. They knew the calculation. They knew what the valley meant and what would have happened if they had followed the order and pulled back. They just didn't talk about it, because that's what that generation did. What this story is about underneath the tactical detail, underneath the artillery coordinates and the battalion scale assaults and the Presidential Unit Citation, is something simpler. It's about what happens when someone in a headquarters tent writes off a unit they've never met based on numbers on a map and an assessment of what's possible, and what happens when the unit decides the assessment is wrong. The British staff officer looked at the map and saw a battalion in an exposed position against overwhelming force. He saw arithmetic. He made the only decision the arithmetic supported. Ferguson looked at the same map and saw something different. He saw terrain his men had been digging into for 6 hours. He saw fields of fire his mortars had already registered. He saw a valley that, if it stayed in Australian hands, kept IX Corps alive. He saw what his men were capable of. The staff officer saw numbers. Ferguson saw soldiers. That gap between what the numbers say is possible and what soldiers actually do is what Kapyong is about. It shows up in every war, in every generation, in every conflict where someone in a comfortable position looks at a map and decides that the men on the ground are finished. Sometimes they're right. At Kapyong, they were not. But here's what the Battle of Kapyong didn't settle. The Korean War went on for 2 more years after that April night. The line moved. Men died. And in the mountains of the peninsula, the soldiers who had held Kapyong went back to the work of fighting a war that nobody back home could quite explain, patrols through terrain that made Vietnam look simple, in weather that made Borneo look comfortable, in a conflict the world had already half forgotten while they were still in it. That story is next.